Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Southwest is Red, the podcast in which we discuss the latest news about the Global South from a Latin American perspective, with a Chinese twist. I'm one of your hosts, Pedro.
And I'm your other host, Nico. Well, we had an intense couple of weeks, no? Exams, papers. The end of semester is coming too fast.
Please, don't mention it. And I don't know, if the end of the semester wasn't enough, like for us, we still have to deal with this crazy heat wave. I don't know, we choose to live in one of the four furnaces of China, right? It's our fault.
I wouldn't say I chose to live here, but yes. I think maybe some of our listeners, or most of them, know that Chongqing is that cyberpunk city in which trains go into buildings, and in order to reach the ground level, you have to take the elevator to floor 22 and whatever. And that is part of the charm of Chongqing, of course. But it is also the city that produces most cars in the world, the Chinese Detroit, we could say. And this presence of lots of factories, plus the huge density of population, plus the fact that it's located in a valley, are a deadly combo once summer is around.
Yeah, I don't want to jump straight into the topic of today, but the things are getting worse. I mean, the articles that we are going to mention today, some of them say that it's difficult to perceive climate change as an urgent thing, but I don't know, for me at least, I can totally perceive it as something urgent. You don't want to live like in 45-degree summers for the rest of your life. For me, it kind of explains why the Chinese government, they have this strong emphasis on the ecological civilization and stuff.
Yes, it's a little bit like that meme says. This is the worst summer of your life. Well, the worst summer of your life for now. Although I hate summer, at least it is watermelon season. And here in China, they take watermelon very seriously because there is a watermelon seller at every single corner.
Yeah.
And there is nothing better than eating some cold watermelon in summer.
Yeah, and there are these pineapples too, like pineapples on a stick. I've seen them and they are kind of refreshing. But let's stop talking about watermelons and heat and etc. And let's go for today's topic, because maybe some of our listeners, they have noticed that our topic selection doesn't seem to follow any kind of logic. There is a logic, okay, but maybe it's not that clear.
Don't tell me there's some logic to this madness. I thought we were just throwing darts at a board called Leftist Podcast Themes.
Well, yes, but the topics are somewhat connected. I don't know, or it can also be my apophenia acting up, but there is a connection. You really don't think so?
Actually, I think you're onto something. Because we began with 3 episodes focused on traditional geopolitical themes: imperialism, great power competition, colonialism. So today's shift toward the psychological and organizational dimensions of the left does feel like a little bit of a departure. You might say that we're moving from a macro perspective to a micro one.
That is true. At least for me, it's clear that we left some breadcrumbs for our listeners to understand how everything came to be. For example, in our first episode, we talked about the meme of do nothing win and how it promotes passivity. Or we also ranted a little bit about social media leftists and how they are like more worried with sharing content than taking real action.
In the article of James Butler that we put as suggested reading, he mentions the fact that in the current environment, spreading awareness in social media has become the only or the most important way of doing something. But take climate change, for example. It is not an issue of awareness anymore. Virtually everyone on the planet knows about it, though, of course, some still deny its existence. But I don't think that a UN report or a peer-reviewed paper will sway the right stance. The resistance isn't rooted in ignorance, it's ideological.
But here you are doing a podcast. That is a way of spreading awareness, right? A touche. But okay, like seriously, maybe we should go a little bit deeper into this idea of spreading awareness. like, in order to understand what are the effects of this excess of information that we have available now. And, we are being bombarded every day from our phones. Every time we open the social media, the information, they come directly to us. Too many people I know, and me included, of course, you too, this constant reminder of that everything is wrong in the world. Every time you check your phone again, it's tiring, it's stressful, overwhelming. So I have a lot of friends who are like, I cannot deal with this anymore, with this hopelessness, this feeling of uselessness too, when they see news about climate disaster, genocide, wars, the rise of fascism, the extreme right. I have to say, I completely empathize with these feelings. We've all been there.
Indeed, we've all been there. But the fact that these feelings are common can sometimes lead us to confuse matters. Because defeatism, or as young people say, doomerism, is not a monolithic phenomenon. When the left discusses defeatism, it often fixates on left melancholy, following Benjamin and Traverso. But that is only a variant of defeatism. So we need to propose a typology of defeatist tendencies within the left, simplified but still illustrative of common patterns. Now, as a disclaimer guy of this podcast, I feel it's been some time since we had a proper disclaimer. So before we start, I wanted to clarify that the types I'll be describing are not the whole picture. Probably, I would say surely, there are many more types of defeatists going around. But I think the types I will talk about are representative of some tendencies that are pretty common within the left.
Oh, well, you and your disclaimers, right, my friend? What is next? Like, did you also prepare a quote from some obscure book that only you and the author read so far?
Well, I won't confirm nor deny. In fact, maybe we can start by discussing the relationship between crisis and mental health in a general way, with a post from Michael Roberts' blog. Roberts is a British Marxist economist, so I would say that qualifies as an obscure quote. He says, according to the latest Human Development Report from the UN, the world is more pessimistic than at any point in modern history stretching back to before World War I. So it seems to me that there is even empirical evidence that most people right now have a pessimistic view of our future due to the polycrisis we are facing. And I think this is particularly true after the pandemic, which hit many of us pretty hard.
Totally. Maybe I was one of the people like interviewed for this report, because this correlation between polycrisis and mental health makes a lot of sense. I often joke with some friends of mine that I would love to have an empty brain, no wrinkles, that smooth brain, man. And of course, not because we think we are smart than others or anything, but precisely because we are tired from making historical associations and noticing these terrible patterns in the international arena while thinking about the future at the same time. How can you think about your future when everything seems to be falling apart?
You make me think about this classic Argentinian rock song by Spinetta that has as a title, and here I'm translating and paraphrasing, I want to stop thinking.
Well, you have no idea. But okay, I think I will use this opportunity to open myself a little bit. Coming to China, like to pursue my studies, was a hard process, like exhausting, to be honest. Fantastic, but exhausting. You just mentioned the pandemic and how crazy it was for us all. I agree 100%, especially because I consider that the pandemic was kind of like a trigger for me. It made me start to think more about my future and what I was doing with my life back then and how could I change it.
It has often been said that the danger of the pandemic was not only COVID, since mental health issues surged a lot at the time.
Yeah,
And these issues are still present for many of us now.
totally. And I don't know, for me, having a goal in mind was one of the things that drove me out of that hole I was in. And talking about hole, I wasn't in a nice position back then. At the start of the pandemic, I had to go back to my parents' house and give up of their independence I've achieved so far. Then I had to work in different kinds of jobs to help at home, and then all at the same time see people close to me losing their jobs, hopes, the perspectives. Everyone was going crazy with that social distancing and everything that we've been through in those years, you know?
Yeah, I don't want to think much about that time. I came to China when the controls were still very strict. So I had to do a 30-day quarantine in a hotel with really, really bad food.
Yeah, well, I can't even imagine. Like the pandemic here must having something else, right? But okay, I think we should go back to the point because we are not here to talk about the pandemic. And what I want to say, I faced a lot of issues at that time, and I would not be able to improve myself to the point of getting the scholarship, move to China without professional assistance. I know some of our listeners will think about getting help from friends, from family, which is super important, of course, but therapy, professional counseling is something else. I don't know. I think you have something. We discussed that, right?
I faced and I'm still facing many mental health issues. And while underlying causes might exist, circumstances also play an important role. Years ago, during a severe depressive episode, I started therapy with a Freudian Lacanian therapist, which is very common in Argentina. And I remember we had very heated debates. I thought I was depressed over losing my job and financial struggles due to unemployment, but he focused on my relationship with my parents. I won't claim I was right, though of course I totally was. But the bigger issue for me is how mental health struggles are often individualized. Therapists, psychiatrists, and social media influencers in many cases tell us that the problem lies in our upbringing, our brain chemistry, or personal trauma, and the solution is self improvement. I agree with you that therapy and medication can help, and I absolutely recommend therapy to anyone who is struggling. But therapy cannot solve the underlying social or political issues that sometimes are the triggers for our mental health struggles. These aren't individual problems, so they demand collective solutions.
Well, I agree, my friend. And I believe that one of the things that it's important for us to note here is that the feelings of defeat and hopelessness we sometimes have, they come from the fact that we think that I cannot do anything to stop everything from happening. We put a lot of responsibility in ourselves as individuals instead of thinking that these are collective problems, which they are. Also, this thing you just said about that we are the problem or we are chemically imbalanced individuals, I don't know. For me, it kind of sounds like we're being treated as faulty products that need to be repaired or something. I swear this is not conspiracy talk or anything. It's just that I have the feeling that, especially with our constant access and dependency towards internet, it's easy to feel that you are a wrong person who needs to be fixed instead of accepting that some problems are beyond individual action. There's no amount of sertraline that it's going to solve this kind of problems, you know? The happy little pills are not going to make the things better.
It can certainly seem that in these current times, on one side we face a polycrisis, as Roberts call it, war, social media saturation, constant reminders that everything is falling apart. And on the other side, we have different reactions: paralysis, depression, helplessness, or an individualist solution through therapy and meds. None of these attitudes can stop the crisis. Some of them make it even worse. And that word, individual and individualist, is crucial. Our despair stems, in part, from realizing that one person alone cannot solve this crisis. Most of us are part of unions or political movements that foster collective action, so we are not used to think about collective solutions. We tend to go immediately inside ourselves. Yet, blaming passive individuals for this is the wrong approach too, no? It is not simple as saying, oh, you should have joined the Communist Party. Even activists and politicians feel this same desperation, even if they continue struggling. As Pepe Mujica said, I belong to a generation that tried to change the world. I was broken and defeated, but I still believe that fighting is worth it.
Please, don't even talk about Mujica. He was something else. And this quote, we belong to a generation that tried to change the world. It kind of reminds me of a speech by Luis Carlos Prestes, a Brazilian communist. I'm not the quote guy like you, my friend. I don't have it like exactly on my mind, but it's on YouTube, a Roda Viva, like an interview show, like popular in Brazil. I will leave the link in the description too for the people who want to watch it. It's totally worth it. And I think that structural changes, like the one that we and our listeners are hoping for, they don't come out of nowhere, or nor they happen by chance, like in films, series, books. They are fruit of hard work, which takes a lot of time and effort to be accomplished. As you said, we can't accomplish anything alone. We are in this together.
I agree. And now that we have established this tension between individual feelings and social, political, and ecological crises, we can go on in developing a specialized vocabulary to better understand this relationship. So perhaps we can categorize defeatism into distinct types: the absolute defeatist, the generational defeatist, and the personal defeatist, with this later one split into the defeated activist and the paralyzed spectator. Now, let me start with the absolute defeatist, who is the one who embodies the idea of left melancholy that we talked a little bit about. They have this idea or this belief that it is impossible to win against capitalism. Typically, they are intellectuals or petit bourgeois, and they often follow the Frankfurt School of Thought. Here, I think we can invoke Lukács' critique of Adorno and others by describing them as residents of the Grand Hotel Abyss. And I quote, "A considerable part of the leading German intelligentsia, including Adorno, have taken residency in the Grand Hotel Abyss, a beautiful hotel equipped with every comfort on the edge of an abyss, of nothingness, of absurdity. And the daily contemplation of the abyss, between excellent meals or artistic entertainments, can only heighten the enjoyment of the subtle comforts offered." So these figures seem to take pleasure in witnessing collapse, from the safety of their privileged spot in the ivory tower, of course. I don't believe engaging with them is productive, because they are not even real leftists. In fact, we should purge them from our canon and from our consumption, because they poison the movement.
Ah, okay, so now you're arguing for a purge, right? Well, okay, I just want to say that for me, the Grand Hotel Abyss is on the internet right now. Twitter, Reddit, or the social media. We see a lot of people like that online. But okay, you go. I want to know more about the other kind of defeatists.
Well, next we have the generational defeatist. This type stems from the arc of the 20th century history. Revolution rose, crested, then receded. First came the defeats of the 70s, and by the 90s, with the USSR collapse, the left shifted to defense mode. As Warren Buffett says, there is a class war and we are winning. So for many of the older generation that lived through that, there is a consciousness of defeat that in many cases led them to inaction, passivity, or to focus on reform within the system.
I agree with you, but I don't know. I also have a different perspective on this matter. But I think it's better for us and for the listeners too to let you finish your point, right?
Okay, then I will continue with the individual defeatist of the activist variant. The person who says, "I tried, but I failed." And I think that anyone involved in organizing knows this pattern. People join, they face setbacks, they become demoralized, and they leave. Political defeat is an inevitably part of militancy. It's like Rosa Luxemburg famously said, no? Revolution is the only form of war in which victory can be prepared only by a series of defeats. Yet, while the left understands the necessity of defeats, and there has been a lot of theory about this, little has been done to address survival through defeat, or how to continue fighting. And that is why Hannah Proctor's article is such an interesting contribution to this debate. Let me quote a paragraph. There seem to be no equivalent resources for enabling people on the left to work through our own psychological experiences. Yet the need seems more urgent. It is one thing to speculate at a distance about other people's mental motivations, but quite another to address psychological pain and suffering in our own movements. And it is not as if there isn't a whole repertoire of defeats and disappointments to draw from. Could anything be gleaned from this historical experience that might help to make sense of the psychological toll of political defeat? So, Proctor's work dismantles left melancholy as an antidote to defeat. In our typology, left melancholy aligns with generational defeat and is sometimes exploited by the fake leftists of absolute defeat. But in fact, it offers no comfort to grassroots activists in the real world. Proctor's alternative, mournful militancy, is compelling because it avoids the passive contemplation of left melancholy while resisting the hollow optimism often pushed by political organizations.
Well, my friend, you are really the quote guy. This Rosa quote about victory is a series of defeats is something that quite sums up what I think too. Revolution isn't a stroll on the part. We can be trapped in this fake positivity thing too. So I agree.
Yes, there is a delicate balance there between blind optimism and pure pessimism. Now let me move to the final type, the paralyzed spectator. That I think it's a category many of us encounter daily. This is the screen addicted person who, after hours of doom scrolling, says, I feel overwhelmed. There is nothing I can do. First, let me acknowledge that we've all been there, because social media overexposure is a defining feature of modern life. But a crucial detail about this way of thinking is the I. I feel overwhelmed. There is nothing I can do. Because, of course, you alone cannot stop genocide, you alone cannot solve climate change. But why even frame this crisis in individual terms? Even the most powerful leaders in the world cannot single-handedly fix everything, as a certain orange guy is currently finding out. The real issue is that instead of collective action, we are confronting the world from a position of isolated individualism.
Well, I think I can say what I'm thinking now, because it kind of relates with everything you just say. I just want to shed light on a different perspective. Maybe it won't make much sense, I don't know, but since we decided, we choose this topic for today's episode, I'm reading about this. So I honestly think that the way we, and by we, let me clarify, I mean people affected by the geopolitical West, we perceive time has something to do with everything you said so far. And of course, I'm not trying to go for the classical East versus West argument. So let me put it in a different way. I need to clarify that when I mention time, I'm also thinking about culture. And I don't want to be the Captain Obvious here, but it's important to stress that we, the proletarians of the world, the poor people, we come from different backgrounds and cultures. And, well, there is a lot of studies highlighting these differences.
Please go on, because I'm a little bit confused at the moment.
Okay, and I think the listeners are too. So, I was reading some papers about how East Asian culture, well, for example, is traditionally more collective, interdependent, and more contextual than ours. So by being more collective and interdependent, it kind of makes me think about what you just said about this lack of organization and cohesion. And according to a paper published by Choi, these cultures, they have a clear different mindset when it comes to time perception. She says that East Asians, they have what she calls a polychronic perception of time, which means that they don't follow a linear monochronic time frame as many of the Westerners. In other words, they have a perception of time that sees the time in a more fluid way, emphasizing more human interaction over crazy schedules that are pushed onto us. Oh, okay, let me add something else. I don't know if your listeners or you, my friend, are familiar with the Zimbardo time perspective inventory. Like this guy, Zimbardo, he developed a questionnaire that measures individuals' attitudes towards time in different countries and cultures. And he categorized them in 5 perspectives. It would be too much to talk about all the 5, so I chose 3 that they kind of relate with everything, like present hedonist, present fatalistic, and future. Well, the present hedonist, it's related to individuals that prefer to live the moment, seek new sensations, experience and everything they can, They focus on short-term gains. We all know people like that, right? And the fatalists, they would fall into what you just say about absolute defeatist kind of people. The ones who see future as predetermined and they are apathetic, always thinking things like individual actions can't solve anything, so why would I bother trying? And the final one, the future category, describes people who are willing to sacrifice the present in order to achieve their goals. And that's precisely where I want to get. Because I see this category, it's something that we should strive for. We should strive to become like that,
I don't agree much with the methodologies of this kind of research and with its implications even. But I think I need to let you finish in order to really understand the argument.
Can I say something? I knew you would disagree, but well, that's one of the points of this podcast, right? We don't need to agree with everything. But when we are having a conversation these days, you mentioned like the leftist defeat during the 70s and how like the rise of neoliberalism after that was one of the main responsibles for this whole situation that we are describing, we are living right now. I totally agree with you on that. But for me, it's not the only reason for this crazy mess, I know I think too much about hegemonic power. It's my IR background. So for me, analyzing how Britain and the US, after them, they pushed this logic of work onto us is something that we should take into account when we are talking about these things.
Do you want to say that capitalism changed our experience of time?
Yes. Oh, well, to be fair, I'm not so sure about how valid these categories of time perception are for us, like the people of the global south. But even if we can't apply these categories in the same way, I do think that colonialism, capitalism, they changed the way we perceive and organize our time. Britain and United States, they shoved like this capitalist logic globally, like pushing their time organization and perception onto us at the same time. So in my perspective, this is a major source of general depression and paralysis, like versus what is going on with the world lately. The Portuguese, they use it to say that the Latin American population, the natives, they were lazy, even though they worked hard and died for them as slaves. The thing is that we, again, like the proletarians, poor people, we still work a lot to sustain the elites both in and outside our countries. And while trying to organize our daily routines to be constantly more productive for them, and well, not to mention the pressure, we have to use our free time to become smarter, to acquire more knowledge that will be useful somehow. So it's like an endless cycle of perfecting ourselves. And we are perfecting ourselves not for us.
Well, I think now I understand more clearly what is the point that you're trying to make. For me, the main problem I see with this kind of Eastern cultures or Latin American cultures are collectivist thing is that I usually reject this kind of cultural essentialism. For me, capitalism is a global process, and this means that it tries to destroy every cultural specificity, both in East and West. However, I do agree that capitalism has fundamentally altered how we experience time. As Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All that is solid melts into air. all that is holy is profane, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life, and his relationships with his kind. In this quote, I think it expresses very clearly how capitalism dismantles old social structures while preventing new ones from solidifying, leaving us in a state of perpetual instability. But I struggle to view this shift through the lens of essential cultural or ethnic identities. Because it is not that capitalism imposes a unique conception of time on East Asian or Latin American societies. Rather, it redefined time for all pre-capitalist societies, including European ones.
Well, we will definitely disagree on that. Capitalism did impose new conceptions on Europeans and later US American citizens, for sure. And no need to mention that they are facing these problems too. But at the same time, I can't ignore this cultural and societal background that distinguish us from them. And besides, we spoke a lot about concepts of core, periphery, dependency on the previous episodes. A perception, way of life of someone who belongs to the metropole, who was raised in that milieu and can benefit itself from it, even when they are part of the proletariat, will be different from someone at the opposite side. You don't think so? Like in the periphery? Well, here's the point I'm trying to make. Like for me, the points I mentioned just now, they are complementary with your perspective. Capitalism is the one to blame, of course, precisely because it is trying to homogenize something that can't be homogenized. So that's it. I think our time perception is also going nuts, right? So how about we take a pause before we move to the next part?
We are back with more content on how to stop being such losers. In the first section, we analyze different forms of defeatism. The recurrent answer to what should we do often being nothing because. But not everyone embraces that attitude. Not everyone is stuck in Ned Flanders' that mode. We tried nothing and we are all out of ideas. There are many who try to change things, and in some cases they fail, of course. Some listeners might be familiar with the Jakarta method, Vincent Bevin's book on US-backed massacres of leftist movements worldwide. His more recent book, If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution, is even more relevant because it's reflective of the contradictions of 2010's leftism. Bevins categorizes the mass protest decade as beginning with the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt in 2010, which led to the fall of governments across the region, including Libya and Syria. One key observation from his Vox interview describes how these protest cycles usually went. After governments cracked down on an initial small group of protesters, the squares swell with more and more demonstrators. In the midst of a leftist eruption, the far right quickly co-opts the momentum. But this framing is overly broad. Bevins also covers Brazil's 2013 protest during Dilma Rousseff government, a movement that should never be equated with Mubarak's downfall, despite tactical similarities. Yet, here again, we see US liberal media's tendency to conflate vastly different political events, mudding any real understanding of them. But before going further, I just wanted to ask you, how do you feel about comparing Brazil 2013 to Egypt 2010? Bevins, who is from the US, goes so far as to call Brazil an imperfect democracy. Those gringos.
Let me ask you something. Is this a safe space? Because really, after I read that article, I was like, Oh, buddy, if I knew you at the time, I could have paid you a visit and show you how imperfect we are, you know? But, well, gringos, right? We can't expect much from them. Or maybe we can, because in this case, there is a lot of misinformation. Bevins, like, he admits that they, the US Americans, Europeans who were covering the protests back then, they didn't have the intellectual or material resources to do that properly. But in the end, they cover it anyway, right? And also serve the Washington's foreign policy agenda. But my opinion, it doesn't make sense at all, this comparison between Egypt and Brazil. The points that they label as similarities are not that similar. Let's take the economic aspect as an example. In Brazil, we had a huge combo of unfavorable international demand for commodities and the failed domestic policies also. On the other hand, Egypt was facing unemployment and, unemployment problems related to demographic changes, and there is the subsidized goods question too. I mean, a lot of Egyptians back then, they relied on subsidized goods to live. And about the corruption thing, which I just want to mention en passant that corruption should be an episode. But it was also different. Operation Car Wash was one of the major causes of our Brazilian political crisis back then. But how can we equate it to the Mubarak family succession thing? Mubarak was a dictator. Come on. How he and Dilma could be this, you could put them in the same spot, like to compare them. So I believe the only thing that can truly connect like these scattered movements around the world at that time was the police brutality, which was really something.
I agree. I think that Bevins tends to generalize and maybe take these tactic similarities or the police response, but he often left outside the political reasons behind these movements. For example, even when he talks about leftist eruptions, when we review these movements across the world, many of them were actually advocating for liberal democracy. Some had leftist elements, that's true, but overall they were disorganized. He himself notes that the meaning of the movement is incapable of speaking in one coherent voice. So he recognizes the mismatch between tactics and goals, or what a Marxist would call strategies, but fails to pinpoint that a specific favored tactic led to the total failure of these movements. And here I want to clarify that this is not to dismiss those movements entirely. Some had good intentions and achieved partial successes. But a key failing was their outright rejection of organization and leadership, the fetishization of rhizomatic, spontaneous, media-savvy movements. Liberal media loved this narrative because it fit their vision of democratic uprisings. Yet for those on the ground, it meant sending themselves into chaos without structure, to face the police and, in some cases, the military without organization. And without real organization, the learning process was slowed down, the demands of the movement were harder to communicate, and demoralization became inevitable. Ironically, the supposed advantages of disorganization enable this far-right cooptation that Bevins describes.
One question that keeps popping up in my mind: did we learn from that? Are we capable of organizing ourselves better after that failure of 1 decade ago? I mean, it's a genuine question because, and talking as someone who was on the streets in 2013, I believed it in that rhizomatic fantasy that we were doing something organic and contributing to democracy somehow. And you are right. It's easy to become demoralized and be co-opted by the far right, the extreme right. So in that paper, Bevins, he mentions how the government that came after in Egypt was worse than Mubarak's administration. For us, it wasn't the same. We didn't get that level of right, but Temer did a lot of neoliberal damage to us in the years following Dilma's coup.
You're right, and we could even say that without the coup, Bolsonaro would not have been possible either. So there's a long history there to analyze. And I think we are not learning enough from these movements, and figures like Bevins, in fact, make that process even harder. And a useful contrast is Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which offers a sharp critique of the limitations of leftist movements in confronting climate change. Because unlike broader political struggles, climate change is backed by near total scientific consensus. Everyone except the right acknowledges its reality and urgency. Yet, as James Butler notes in his review of Malm's book, confronting the facts can be paralyzing. The sheer scale of the crisis is enough to overwhelm many, but that's not the only issue. Malm's key contribution is addressing not just a paralyzed individual type, but the structural failures within leftist organizations. As Butler also says, if only we knew, we would act in the right way. But there is no obvious point at which knowledge tips into action. In an increasingly mediatized political sphere, spreading awareness ends up as a substitute for action itself. Here, the author inadvertently points to a major flaw in today's ecological movement. It has become a propaganda machine, obsessing over mass persuasion rather than building actionable structures. And as you noted, too much information can be just as paralyzing as too little.
I just want to say that How to Blow Up a Pipeline is the kind of title I would like to create, to have this idea if I would ever write a book. Well, yeah, it's completely overwhelming. It's paralyzing, especially when you have no time to think about it and you have thousands of distractions to keep your mind away from the real problems around you. And about this thing of spreading awareness versus action, I agree with you and Mom. It's much easier to engage in online discussions and share nice infographics about how we're being cooked, not so slowly, than actually going outside and shutting down a mining company.
Right, that's another problem, no? The possibility of action, or which actions are possible. Because according to Malm, the movement has largely adopted a pacifist social democratic theory of change, spreading awareness in hope that eventually the government will be forced to act. Does this sound familiar to you? Because for me, this is precisely the strategy that is described by Bevins: mass protests pressuring government into reform. And to be fair, this approach can be sometimes effective, but Malm identifies key flaws in this theory, which with regards to climate change. The first one is timing, because time is running out, and every delay compounds the urgency of future action. The more we take to act, the higher the cost of action will be in the future. And then reformist methods, or as Bukharin said, socialism as at a tortoise pace, are ill-suited. And another crucial issue is pacifism. Like Malm argues, pacifism holds that violence is bad in all settings, because this is what history shows. Success belongs to the peaceful. This is a strong and wrong claim, and Malm spends a lot of the book showing why it is wrong. But many people believe in this. Do you think it's really that simple? That peace is always correct and violence is always bad?
I would really love to know what kinds of history books these many people are reading. I mean, it's not about going berserk every time you disagree with something, but we are talking about our future. Come on, I may sound a little bit controversial, but I do agree with what you say that there can be some changes when you do peaceful demonstrations. But as you mentioned, we don't have time for that anymore, right? This social democrat posture, like mentioned by Malm, led many of us too comfortable with everything, and I couldn't disagree more with this attitude. It is precisely because the left around the world resorted to these peaceful approaches that the right managed to make this crazy amount of damage. In some cases, of course I'm not generalizing or anything, I would even call inaction instead of pacifism. Sometimes I wonder what Lenin would say about making memes to fight the extreme right. He would probably not find it funny at all.
Speaking of Lenin, one amusing detail from one of the articles that we have in our reading list is that one is titled Ecological Leninism. And when I first read Malm's book, I wonder what exactly makes Malm Leninist? Because to me, rather than Vladimir Ilyich, he actually reminds me of Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's brother, who was a populist executed for conspiring to assassinate the Tsar. Sure, the critique of social democracy could be considered Leninist, and Lenin certainly wasn't a pacifist. But calling these 2 points Leninism feels a bit broad. That said, some of Malm's arguments do bear resemblance to Lenin's thought. Most notably, his critique of social democracy and the current ecological movement highlights an obsession with the state. Recall the mobilization model both Bevins describes and Malm critiques. First, spread awareness. Then, as awareness reaches critical mass, people join the mass protests. Finally, the government, fearing unrest, reacts. But this model assumes the state is a primary locus of power and that it can really solve the issues, when in reality, we know that capital is dominant. So, fighting climate change means confronting the fossil fuel cartel, the military industrial complex, and structures that are beyond the capitalized state capacity to challenge. This reframes what's necessary. As Tooze argues, we need to mobilize the state in ways unseen since World War II. But that alone won't be enough. We must also mobilize society, change its structures, implement economic planning, and rationalize the economy. In short, we need a revolution.
Okay, now you're talking, my friend. Like, let's bring the real populists back. And some people, especially liberals, they love to repeat the mantra that the state is an all powerful being, but we are quite aware that this is not the reality, right? The state is powerful, indeed, but it has long been co-opted by the capital. The thing is that profit has blinded the elites to the point that they made the state and a large part of us to ignore this incoming climate catastrophe. Also, if you want to wage total war, you must first have a clear enemy in front of your eyes. For me, these elites, they live in a mix of this is not so bad as they say, plus we are rich and powerful enough to escape from this situation if things go real bad, real crazy. Which for me explain also this obsession with some of them about let's live in Mars and SpaceX, or some kind of space hotel with all the junk, you know.
When they say that, I can only think, let them go. Don't threaten me with a good time. You want to go to Mars? Go, my friend. We can solve things here by ourselves. Going back to Malm, I think he provides an insightful perspective of what we can do to address the ecological crisis, but there's more ambiguity when it comes to how we should do these things. So his critique of pacifism and of social democracy is compelling, and certainly he explores practical application of militant strategies from his experiences in Germany and in Sweden. But in today's climate, where certain statements invite demonetization or shadow banning, his discussion remains largely hypothetical. And this even happens in the reviews where they say, well, in theory, if we follow his ideas, and they don't really want to say what they are even thinking about. And this is understandable because free speech, as most of our listeners should know and likely know, is an illusion, especially in social media. That said, I think there's one crucial aspect that Malm does not address so much, and it is organization. I would say that I wouldn't recommend anyone to dive straight into Lenin's What is to be done, but for those interested, I think a good introduction is largely What is to be done in context, because besides having a great translation, it really provides, as the title says, the context of what Lenin was saying. And if you read the analysis of Lee, you will learn that the real focus of Lenin's book isn't working class consciousness, and maybe that's what most people know the book for, but organization. His central concern was how the party structure could change in order to broaden its appeal and to better fight the Tsar's regime. And this is precisely what's missing from Mann's work. He critiques strategy, he critiques tactics, but he doesn't outline a concrete organizational model. And this absence isn't unique to Mann. It's a broader issue in leftist discourse today, where theoretical debates often overshadow discussions on real world organizing.
Well, the eternal problem of lack of practice, right? I would like to say two things. First is that organization requires will. And I'm not only talking about political will, individual will, sure. So I'm not so sure if I could say that, but I have the impression that most people who want to change, they want this big change, they are not willing to take the risks involved with it. For a lot of reasons, of course. A lot of people, and I can include myself in this, they are too busy with other things, such as studies or working like crazy to get the minimum, like I was living back in Brazil, for example. So it is not easy, I know that. And the second one is that this failure of doing something practical makes some people inside the movement get frustrated, and also it keeps others from joining them, because no one wants to join a failed movement. If they see no future in repeating the same mistakes, or they think that if they end up by joining, they decide to join an organization, they won't be able to change anything. So it's like a maze, it's a desperate situation.
I agree. There's this clear connection between defeatism and organizational failures. It's totally natural to feel demoralized when the supposedly best strategies repeatedly fail, especially when we are being told there is no alternative. This is the only way, the best way. In many ways, the dominant political frameworks we've discussed are already defeated from the outset, since they are rooted in flawed historical assumptions and tactics that are ill-suited for today's crisis. But for me, the real irony would be to reduce this to an awareness problem by suggesting that people feel defeated simply because they don't understand true Leninism. There's a deeper displacement at play. If you remember, if we go back to our typology, we identified two individual defeatists. One is the activist and the other is the passive spectator. Books like What is to be Done or How to Blow Up a Pipeline are written for activists. They are guides on organizing movements. But the real challenge we are facing now is not just organizing committed militants. It's figuring out how to organize militants in order to mobilize passive consumers drowning in TikTok feeds. That's where spreading awareness falls short. Or at least it fails to work quickly enough.
Well, exactly, my friend. I wish we had a special red button that we could press and make all capitalists change their minds and use their wealth to do something nice for us all. Well, some of you will think that this button exists and it is called revolution, and I would not disagree, of course. But now I think I should leave a disclaimer here before we end this episode, right? Because we are not here to provide a magic formula that is going to solve everything, precisely because this formula doesn't exist. We spoke a lot about organization and how we are stronger together, but in the end, everything starts with you first. I'm not saying this from a standpoint of someone who knows everything, which actually is quite the opposite. We both, right, my friend, I think I can speak for you. We are constantly striving to learn more and do what we can do. So, I don't know, it's even difficult for me to find the right words, but what I want to say is engage in real world activities, connect with people that are trying to do something meaningful, and most importantly, contribute with your actions and thinking to make things happen outside your feed. You know, it won't be easy for sure, but that's the thing. It was never easy in the past too. Do you think that Lenin was strolling the park back then? So, I don't know, if you want real change, you will have to fight for it.
While Lenin was strolling around the Siberian parks. That a beautiful experience, probably. I think that this idea of if you want real change, you will have to fight for it is a great line to end today's episode because we are running out of time. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, leave your comments too. We want to know if your listeners can relate to what we just spoke about, and most importantly, read what kind of strategies you are using to deal with these issues. So that's it. 再见 and see you in the next episode.
再见。